Welcome to NYC Lean Kanban, everybody. As Jonathan said in his very elaborate introduction, he already asked, but I'm going to ask again because I didn't see. How many people here are familiar with Cynefin? Oh, okay, that was a lot. How many people are familiar with complexity theory? Ooh, good. Okay, you may tweet at NYClean or NYClean for the dirty tweets. And I'm also at Jocko Selberg or Jocko21@gmail. Now, when I'm done with all this stuff and you find that you're still interested, I'm looking to see who might be interested in an NYC Cynefin group. So if you are interested in this kind of thing, let me know. Give me like a business card or something, and I'll seek you out. Once again, we're going to be having a lean coffee after the talk, so write down your topics. I see some people already are. That's awesome. That's interesting. So, I want to start off with a question. How many people have vivid memories of when they were 5 years old? Okay, that's most. How about 6 years old? Keep your hands up. Okay, good, because that means you're going to love this. Story time. Come on, when you were 5 years old, this was like the most exciting part of your day. Story time! You guys, all right. Well, story time today is brought to you by Mr. Narrative Fragments and Little Miss Context. And they love each other very much. In fact, they're not actually married, but they are cohabitating, if you know what I mean. Yes. They're well, you're not ready for that yet. So today's story time is going to be a little bit different in that I'm not actually going to tell you a story, but I am going to provide you with a list of lovable characters, crazy characters. And here's the thing. You're actually going to create your own story. It's going to magically appear into your head. So that's kind of cool, if not kind of trippy. And in order to do that, I'm going to show you a short 15-second video to get your juices going. Okay? So is everybody ready? Yeah, let's begin.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
So what is going on here? What I'm interested is what's going on in your brains, right? In order to explain that or to talk about it, you can think of this as being three little vignettes all tied together into one. And what's interesting is that our brains actually construct a story, right, based on our perception of the context. And initially, this is happening very quickly, so you actually create the story and the context simultaneously at the same time, which is pretty trippy. So for example, in the first little vignette, we see a car arrive, and we see Mr. Skinhead turning and scampering away. Okay? How many people here thought that Mr. Skinhead was running away from the car? It's interesting. It's a little over half of you. How many thought the car had nothing to do with it and he was running toward something? That's almost some of you are repeating, which is interesting. How many thought something else? Okay, that's a couple. That's interesting too. But again, we're creating a story based on almost no information, and we do it instantaneously. We can't help ourselves. Okay, so if we change the context a little bit more because we're moving along through the story, right? We're getting additional information. So on the second one, we see Mr. Skinhead engaging Mr. Trenchcoat Man. So how many thought that he was trying to help Mr. Trenchcoat Man? Let me help you with your bags. They look heavy. Nobody? Okay. How many thought that he was trying to dance with him? No? You? Yeah, I know you did. How many people thought he was mugging him? Yeah, that's a typical answer. See, we're creating stories that are similar, which is interesting too, based on the same information, but we still don't know anything about these characters. Yet we construct a story, and we construct a context for that story to live in. For instance, is Mr. Skinhead a criminal? right? Or maybe he's an undercover cop. The story you create, depending on which one that you think he is going to be different, right? And is Mr. Trenchcoat Man, is he a banker? Or is he a drug kingpin? Right? So the stories that you create are going to be different. And what's the deal with this car? Did anybody incorporate the car into their story? And what's her deal? What's she doing? Right? So I'm going to change the context on you one more time, which happened in the story, and that is we see the bricks falling. And the story starts to come together a little bit. So we see Mr. Skinhead Man saving Mr. Trenchcoat Man from the falling bricks. Or is he? Right? We still don't know anything about these characters. Right? So the other interesting thing that's going on here is these stories can be radically different based on your point of view, or more specifically on your identity. Right? And I'm going to get into identity a little bit later on. But for instance, say I'm the bro, and I'm friends with Mr. Skinhead Man. And I know that Mr. Skinhead Man is the nicest guy in the world. The story I construct is going to be one thing, but if I know that Mr. Skinhead Man is Mr. Scumbag, I'm going to construct a different story. And you can only imagine what Officer O'Malley is going to construct. Okay? Construct isn't actually quite the right word. It's more like it's a growing thing, but I'll leave it at that for now. Now, I'm going to change the context on you again, which is, I hate to be the one to break it to you, but these are all actors. This is all scripted. This is a commercial for The Guardian in 1986. If I'm the director, the stories I'm creating, all the stories that you created are invalid. But because from the director's point of view, he's going to be looking at, well, you know, did he make his cue? Did the bricks fall right? Is all the actors in the right place? Should I have got it in color? Could be anything. Okay, so the stories can be radically different based on your point of view or your context. And so here's what I'm getting at is we often find ourselves responding to events without fully considering or taking into consideration the context that they reside in. Okay? Another word for this is categorization. We categorize. And categorization is a first fit pattern match. For those of you that are familiar with Kahneman, it's not a best fit pattern match. So information comes into our brain, and our brain says, what's the most plausible explanation for what's going on? And if it makes sense and it matches up with your history of how you view things, then it plops into a categorization. Okay? Now, categorization is a wonderful thing. Huh? Oh, yeah? I can't even hear it. Okay, thank you. Categorization is a wonderful thing because it allows us to make very quick decisions, right, based on very limited information. Okay? But the problem with categorization is once we categorize something, it's very difficult cognitively to change our mind about it. This is also bias. Bias. Okay, anchoring bias. Now this is very interesting for those of you that are project managers or executives, as you may be anchored into the idea that all the work that you do needs to be done in a highly structured manner. Or let's say a waterfall, right? And we get anchored into that, and we shove all of the work through that system because it's the only way that we think that we can do it. We're anchored into that point of view. And I hate to break it to you or to say this, but agilists are no different, right? It might be everything has to go through Scrum, or everything, you know, it's got to be in the sprint, and we got to have the backlog, and we got to do this, and we got to do that. All of your solutions are Scrum-type solutions, and the same thing could apply for Kanban. Or it could apply for any of the methods that you might be utilizing. Okay? So the question is, given the fact that we are very prone to categorization, we can't help it, and it's very useful for us to do so. But how can we make sense of a situation so that we can respond intelligently, given the fact that we have very limited information? And whenever a decision is required, we are always limited by incomplete information. It's just the way that it is. We might have enough information that we can act, but it's always incomplete information. Okay? So context is everything here, right? There are are no universal solutions, but there are contextual solutions, solutions that fit inside a particular context. So there are different ways of doing things based on the context that you're operating in. Right? So if you're operating in a rule set that tells you that the rules that you're operating by are chess rules, all of your solutions are going to be chess-type solutions. And if you can move that or change the context, which Captain Kirk does here, he's in a bind. He thinks he's in a checkmate. These aliens got him by the, and there's nothing he can do. He thinks he's in checkmate. But then he realizes if he just shifts the context a little bit and shifts it over to poker, now he has some options available that he didn't have when he was thinking in chess-based rules. So he can bluff here. It's very difficult to bluff in chess. But that's how he ends up getting out of the bind, and we get 7 terrible movies. So how can we accurately sense the context that we're operating in such that we might better act in that context? What tools do we have available that might be able to help us to do that? I think you probably know the answer to this, but Cynefin is a very useful tool. It can be either used at a deep level, or it can be used as a generalized high-level heuristic to help you figure out how you might want to deal with a particular problem. So that's my intro. And in order to dive a little bit deeper, I want to get really down to the baseline here, and I want to talk about order. Now, before I do that, I'm going to set an anchor for you, which I just talked about. And I want you to consider this during the rest of the talk. He or she who defines the constraint anchors the solution space. Right? So here it's the judge in the courtroom. He's operating under the constraints of the law, but in his courtroom, he's setting the constraints. He can allow evidence in, he can overrule, he can sustain objections. He sets the constraints of how things are going to go in that particular courtroom. Okay? So what is order? Well, I've defined it for you, so it's pretty easy. The arrangement or disposition of people or things in relation to each other according to a particular sequence or pattern. Does anybody notice anything about these pictures? Same word, order, used in different contexts. So it looks like you're in a cafeteria here. This is where you place your order. Here, things are out of order. Here, order in the court. Same word, different context. But what I really want to drive at is, how does order happen? Must we always create order, or is it possible that order can emerge? That's what I'm going to get into as we move along here. And in order to help us to do that, I want to build a little, it's not a model, but a way possibly of looking at this is if we think of maybe there's being 2 different types of order, or realms of order, one of which is directed, that is where order is directed or imposed. That's a very human, we're very, very good at that as human beings. It's one of the things that separates us or differentiates us from other species, is the level of sophistication that we can do this. Ants can do it, but nowhere near the same that we can do it. Or is there another type of order, which I'm calling emergent order, where order emerges out of starting conditions, initial starting conditions. This is, I'm represented as a sapling, right? It's organic, it's ecological. Now, in order to differentiate these 2 or define them out a little bit, we're going to look at it in terms of the relationship between cause and effect. And I'm going to say this over and over and over again. The relationship between a cause and effect in a directed, ordered system is well established. We know what it is. We've done it a million times before. It has history, right? And if we don't know what it is, we can discover it. It's discoverable. Emergent order is a little bit different because the order emerges out of the system conditions. We say that the relationship between cause and effect are unknown to us, or they're not perceivable, or it's even possible they don't exist at all. Okay? So for the purposes of Cynefin, I'm going to rename directed order to ordered and emergent order to unordered. Bingo. There it is. I've renamed them. Same thing. I've moved this little reminder stuff down here so you can refer to them. how many people are familiar with the concept of linear relationships and nonlinear relationships? Good, that should make it a little bit easier, but I'm going to give you some terrible examples of this. Well, they're just kind of, they're homey examples. So linear relationships are where the output is directly proportional to the input, right? So if I want to make a batch of brownies, and I decide I love brownies, so I'm going to make a double batch of brownies. If I double all the ingredients, I will get a double batch of brownies, right? Input is directly proportional to output. Output is directly relational to input. Now, if I take my double batch of brownies, or let's say I take the single batch of brownies and I go over to the oven that I've preheated to 400 degrees, and I say I really want these brownies soon, if I crank up the oven to 800 degrees, I'm not going to cook those brownies twice as fast, right? Because it has a nonlinear relationship, which is kind of a jokey example, but a real example is, say, I have a semi-serious medical condition and I go to my doctor, and he gives me some semi-serious drugs to take, right? If I double, now he tells me to take 1 pill a day. If I take 2 pills a day, I'm not going to heal twice as fast. In fact, there's a good likelihood I will end up in the hospital or dead. And if I say I have all the time in the world, so I'm only going to take half the dosage, that medication may have no effect on me whatsoever. I'll be wasting my time. So again, in a nonlinear relationships, the output is not directly proportional to the input. In ordered systems, we have a high degree of certainty, because again, we know the relationship between cause and effect, or we can discover it. This makes them highly predictable systems. That's not so in unordered systems. They have lower degrees of certainty because we don't know the relationship between cause and effect. Hence, you can't be certain in these systems. They're less predictable. And so we say that ordered systems are causal because A plus B will equal C, right? However, unordered systems operate differently. That is, they're dispositional. The system may have a propensity to move in a particular direction, but we don't know what it is. So we have to figure out, which I'll get into when I get into complexity, is how we can figure that out a little bit more. But they don't operate causally. Okay? And then these aren't really characteristics, but I want to talk about them anyways. Is ordered systems, because again, we know that relationship between cause and effect. This is where we go to exploit things. This is where we commoditize. This is where we make money. Unordered systems, because of that relationship, this is where we explore. This is where we innovate. This is where we look for outliers. Novelty can occur here. It's very, very difficult to innovate in an ordered system. Constraints are too tight. You don't have enough variation. So how can we manage these different types of systems? How do we act in them, or how can we start to look at it? How should we approach it? Or how do we approach it? Now, I have a big, gigantic Taoist yin-yang symbol in here. I have that on there for a point. It's not because I'm a hippie. But I'm a pseudo-Taoist. Is to point out that ordered systems can have pockets of disorder in them. And unordered systems can have pockets of order in them. It's not either or, necessarily. You have to keep that in mind because we tend to think in a binary manner, this or that. It's not necessarily the case. So that serves as a reminder in the background. Ordered systems, another way of looking at it is ordered systems are where things are made, built, right? Whereas unordered systems are where things grow. And that can help you kind of differentiate between the two, because something that grows you approach differently than something that you build. It's a completely different way of looking at it. So in ordered systems, we manage the plan. We can create a plan because we know the relationship between cause and effect. So we can make a plan, we can set rules, we can set scope, and we can operate within that scope, and we can implement. Right? And we're all pretty familiar with the ordered side here. In unordered systems, that doesn't work, because again, you don't know that relationship between cause and effect. But we can manage the constraints. Right? We can set attractors within boundaries. It's where we can experiment, and I'm going to go deeper into that when I get into complexity. In ordered systems, I'm sure many of you have heard this before, is you can define an ideal future state. And then you can close the gap. Again, that makes sense in an ordered system. It doesn't make sense in an unordered system. In an unordered system, because it's changing all the time, right? You can describe the present, right, and then attempt to influence the direction of the change of the system. We'll get into all of that more when I get into complexity. In ordered systems, we can monitor for adherence to the plan, and it's a governance model. Are you following the plans? Unordered systems, we're more monitoring for emergence. We're waiting to see what comes out of all of this, right? We're looking for patterns, which again, I'll talk about when I get into complexity, and weak signals are important here. Here we tend to strip out weak signals. Here they're very, very important because we're exploring. And then finally, in ordered systems, we architect the solution. It's an engineering-based kind of mentality. We're building things, right? Unordered systems, we amplify or dampen attractors. And I've defined attractor here because this is a complexity theory word. An attractor is a state or set of states towards which a system tends to evolve. Okay, and once the values, I'm cutting in and out a little bit here. So once the system values get close enough to that attractor, they tend to stick near that attractor, right? It's like a terrible friend, right? Or somebody, like a terrible friend, right? So that's an attractor. So we amplify and dampen attractors in unordered systems or in complex systems. And we'll go deeper into that a little bit later. Now I want to start talking about systems, right? How many are familiar with systems thinking? Okay. Systems thinking is an ordered approach. Okay, I just want to point that out. I'm going to define system, but I'm not going to go into it. I'm just throwing it here for completeness. A system is any network with coherence. And an agent, which I'll be using that term a lot in the future, an agent is anything that acts on or within that system. In nature, there's 3 types of systems. And I'm going to define these types of systems using a constraints-based definition. Ordered systems, the system tightly constrains agent behavior. Tightly constrained. The agents can't do a whole lot. They're bounded. Complex systems, the system loosely constrains the agent behavior. So the systems and the agents collectively modify each other's behavior, right? Because they're more loosely constrained. Chaotic systems, the systems impose little or no constraints whatsoever, right? And if all the agents are independent of each other, that their behavior will appear random. So those are chaotic systems, is randomness or apparent randomness. So let's map these 3 systems to my ordered, unordered realms that I had sort of sketched out earlier. Ordered systems, well, not a lot of argument there, right? It goes in order. Complex and chaotic, we're going to put those in unordered because they're more loosely constrained. For the purposes of Cynefin, we're going to break out ordered systems into 2 different domains, depending on our perception of the relationship between cause and effect. We do this because there's kind of degrees of orderedness that is useful for you to put them in, make them into a separate domain so that you can act a little bit differently based on those 2 different domains. We'll talk about that later. So boom, there's your 2 complicated and obvious domain, but there is a 5th domain. This is the domain that everybody forgets about. It's disorder. Don't forget the disordered domain because this is the domain that we're usually in. So don't forget about it, right? And what it is it's the domain of not knowing which of the other domains you're in. Okay. So we're going to rename complex system and chaotic system to domains. We now have 5 domains, and if we jiggle it around a little bit, we get what might be to many of you a familiar Cynefin domains. This is the basis of Cynefin right here in terms of visualization of it. Okay. So we're going to quickly define these real quick in terms of the relationship between cause and effect yet again. Is the relationship in the obvious domain is obvious to all. It's perceivable, it's predictable, it's repeatable. We have history, we've done it before over and over again, so we know what it is. And nobody's going to dispute it. In complicated domain, the relationship is discoverable via analysis. We don't know what it is, but we can figure out what it is, right? Or if we can't figure it out, there's somebody, we try to find somebody who can, who has experience doing it. Right. Complex domain, this one gets a little bit trickier, is the cause and effect relationship is only perceivable to us after the fact, after we've interacted with the system. Okay? We call this retrospective coherence. It makes sense to us after we've engaged in it. It's very difficult to predict the future here because things are not repeatable. And you can't predict the future when things are not predictable, or when you can't predict the future. Not repeatable. Chaotic is a little bit easier. That's just the cause and effect relationship. We just don't know what it is. Right? And even if either we don't know what it is, it's not perceivable to us, or it's possible that it doesn't exist at all. That one's kind of a mind bender. Okay. Now, obvious and chaotic are next to each other for a very important reason. Right? It didn't just fall out this way. And that is, this is the danger zone. Right? Because what happens is if you're in the obvious domain and you've automated stuff and you've taken your eye, you're not focused on it anymore, you don't really pay much attention to it. And when you're not paying attention to things, over time, the system will change around it. Next thing you know, you are doing something that doesn't match the context anymore, and you fall into chaos. So you have to be you have to check things that are in the obvious domain periodically just to make sure that they're not about to fall into the chaotic domain. Just check up on them. So before I move into complexity, I just want to make some notes about Cynefin. Okay? Cynefin is a sense-making framework. It is not a categorization schema. Right? Now, we can't help but categorize things because that's what we do as human beings. But the Cynefin framework itself, and you will categorize it, use it as a categorization schema, especially when you're starting, because you won't be able to help yourself, but that's not what it's useful for. Right? And to explain the difference between a sense-making framework and a categorization schema, the easiest way to explain that is in a categorization schema, your categories come first, they precede the data. So let's say I want to categorize, I have my 4 or 2 by 2 matrix. I put that up on the wall, then I walk over here and I got a big pile of data. I'm looking at the data, and I start plugging it into the categories. That works for a while until I start to realize that this pile of data has ambiguity in it. But what I will do as a human being, because I'm flawed, is I will just go, does that go there? And I'll go, kind of close to that. And I will categorize all of that data, all of it. Right? And that's kind of dangerous. Now, in a sense-making framework, it's different. The data precedes the framework. Okay, so I like to think of this as I have a big pile of data just like before, but I like to envision it as being like a big pile of crossword puzzle pieces. And I look at the big, gigantic pile of crossword puzzle pieces, and I don't take one piece at a time and put it there, then take another one and go, where would that go? That wouldn't make any sense. So I would spread out all the pieces, and I would say, there's a bunch of red pieces. There's a bunch of kind of looks like water pieces. You know, it might be representing water, and here's some green leafy ones. And I would start to notice clusters or create clusters. And then I go, oh, this one has a flat end, a flat side. That's cool. Right? And then I would kind of maybe put them aside. So these things have clustered, and so I'm making sense of what it is rather than categorizing it. So the data, I've made sense of the data, and then I can go and move it, proceed however I want to proceed. Right? So in a sense-making framework, the data precedes the framework. And this, so that's that. I forgot to click that slide. The other important thing which kind of relates to it, hello? Oh, I have to adjust here. How's that? Let me know if I'm piercing your eardrums. The other thing that I want to point out is Cynefin is really about the dynamic movement It's not about the categorization and it sticks and stays in a particular category. You want to move things through the different domains, right? So it's not about the categorization, it's about the movement. And you'll see that a little bit more when we get farther along. Now the fun part, complexity 101. Okay? Now the reason that I wanted to talk about complexity was that the number one problem that I see with people that are new to Cynefin is they don't really understand the difference between the complicated domain and the complex domain. So I want to go a little bit into complexity theory just to help you to differentiate between the two. So remember, the complicated domain is in the ordered side and the complex is in the unordered. Okay. I want you to watch this film. Now don't worry, it loops, nothing happens. It's just watch how it works. What do you notice about it? I notice about 15 things, and I've given you a big fat clue as to what to look for. Flow and self-organization. There you go, bingo. There are no lights, nobody's hitting each other. Nobody's organizing this. It goes into its own flow. Here's some of the things that I noticed. I'm sorry, now I'm all thrown off here. There's no centralized control, as you said. Bingo. The cognition, what's controlling this is distributed cognition. The cognition of how this thing operates is distributed among all the agents entering into the system. Okay? Each actor is also making individual decisions. That's autonomy. Nobody's telling them what to do. Now, each agent is also making, there's dynamic interactions occurring here via continuous micro decisions. Okay, happening continuously. And they're basically following simple rules. So an agent enters into the system. Let's say I'm entering in down here, and I kind of generally know I want to get to the other side. I will enter into, and you've probably done this in Grand Central Station or something before when it's very, very crowded. I'll try to get to the other side, and I'll just kind of flow in. I'll match speed with the other people trying to get to the other side. I won't bump into them. And what's known as fly to the center of flock, but another easier way of thinking of that is kind of maintain the space bubble around you. And if you do that, that's all you got to do, you will begin to develop these flow lines that come together and break apart with no centralized control. Okay? And the locality part is the behavior is dependent simply on the behavior of those that are nearest to you. Right? So this guy doesn't care what this guy's doing. It's only within their localized area that it matters. Okay? And also, we're seeing this from a bird's eye view, so we're seeing it differently than the actual people on the street. But if you're on the street, the agents are generally ignorant of the entire system. They don't need to know about the whole system. In fact, they're probably not thinking at all. They're just entering into the system, go into a flow line, and boom, they pop out on the other side. Okay? So before I go into why that happens, I want to define agent, which I already did, which is an agent is anything that acts on or within the system. Examples of agents might be molecules in a jar. Could be ants in an ant colony. Those are common ones in complexity. We hear about them all the time. But in human complex systems, they're a little bit different because humans are complex systems in and of themselves. But in human systems, it might be memes or tropes or myths. Myths can be agents because they can interact with each other. But more importantly, what I really want to get at is identities. Identities, when we were looking back here, now I did refer to the people as being agents, but in reality it's not. It's their identities. Right? So this is like a pedestrian identity. This is like a driver identity. This is a motor scooter identity. It's not the people, it's the identity that they're holding at the moment. Why that's important is that we are constantly changing our identities. We can do it like that, in a flash, and we do it all the time. Right now, my identity is speaker. Yours is audience member, right? Or I have a 2-year-old kid, And if I'm in daddy identity and I'm talking to my 2-year-old, I'm like, daddy identity. And if I get a phone call and it's work, I don't go on the phone. I switch immediately identities into a different identity, which is a work identity. So I say, yes, change request, yes, send that to HR. That's exactly how I talk at work. I switch identities, but I don't go back to Junior and say, Junior, I want you to submit a change request to mommy for your poopy diaper. I wouldn't do that. But because I can change identities immediately, I can do it like instantaneously, or I can do it over time. So it's not just an instantaneous thing. Okay, so that's identity. So agents are not, humans are not agents. I just want to make that point. Agents are autonomous and can self-organize. I think I demonstrated that on the previous slide. But what's interesting here is the relationship between agents is actually more important than the agents themselves. It's about their connections, their relationships. That's what's important. That one can get me in trouble. So what we have going on here in a complex system is we have agents interacting with other agents, right? They're interacting locally, and they're modifying each other's behavior. So this guy here, he's interacting with this guy, his behavior changes. Interacts with this guy, his behavior changes. And this guy's same thing's going on there. So you already have a lot going on, and we're only pointing at 3 dots, right? And they're all doing that locally. And what you'll also notice here is that proximity and connectivity are key in complex systems, right? So this guy is not connected to this guy. This guy's not connected to this guy, right? Because if I connected all of these agents together, the system would freeze up. Nothing could happen. It would lock up. If you over-connect a system, it'll freeze up. And on the other hand, if I underconnect the system, if none of these are related or connected to any of the other agents, that's chaos. That's pure randomness, because none of the agents have any relationship to any of the other agents. And in complexity theory, we say that complexity is a sliver of constraint in between being ordered, overly structured, or being understructured in a chaotic sense. So if you can have the right environments where you can have the sweet spot of connections, very, very interesting things can happen. That's what we're looking for in a complex system. So proximity and connectivity are key, and the simple rules can act as both constraints and enablers. I'm not going to go into that because of time constraints, but I wanted to make the point. Now we have all these agents, but they're also in a system. And you can define system however you want. It's not really that relevant, but the agents in the system are also interacting. So the agent's interaction with the system changes the system behavior, which then feeds back and changes the agent's behavior. While they're interacting with each other, it starts to get really nutty, right? Each may also modify the behavior of the other. We say that they co-evolve, because all of this is happening at the same time. Order emerges in these systems. It is not imposed. So very quickly to summarize what's going on is the agents are interacting with each other. New patterns emerge via those interactions. Patterns modify behavior. They either amplify or dampen, or positive or negative feedback loops, which I'm explaining here. Positive and negative feedback loops develop, which act to amplify or dampen existing patterns, further modifying the behavior of the agents. Round and round we go. But in actuality, it's not round and round, because we say rinse and repeat a billion times, but in actuality, it's happening concurrently. It's all happening at the same time. This is not a circle. This is not a loop. This is it. All at the same time. That's fundamentally different than how we generally, you see so many of these loops in ordered systems. Complexity doesn't have that. It's happening concurrently. Okay, and then there's more. These systems may also act as agents in a larger system, right? So here we have all these systems interacting with other systems inside of another system. We say that they're hierarchical, right? So the systems can both contain subsystems and can be contained by larger systems. Who's familiar with fractals? That's what's going on in fractals. I was going to show you a groovy picture of fractals, but I stripped it out. Here's the kicker. This is why this is important. At each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear, right? So in here, this system has properties that are independent of the agents acting in it, so on and so forth, right? That's the hierarchical part. So to summarize all this very, very quickly, complexity, multiple autonomous agents interact with each other in the system. Simple rules or constraints can produce very complex interactions. Doesn't need to be very complex rules. In fact, that will force the system to fall apart. Agents self-organize. There is no centralized control. Another key aspect. Order emerges in these systems is not imposed. These systems and agents co-evolve, right? And the interesting thing about co-evolution is that it is irreversible, right? There's only the current state. In other words, I can't ungive this presentation. And worse yet, you can't unsee it, right? Whether that's for good or ill. But it is irreversible nonetheless. Systems are hierarchical, so as I said, the properties change at each level. New properties appear. You could think of that as being like cells. Cells get together, they form organs. Property of the organ is different than the cells, clearly. They get together, they form an organism. They have properties that are different than the organs, so on and so forth, all the way up to society, and you can keep going, right? These systems are dynamic. That's a key point. Systems are changing continuously. So the big question becomes, can such a system be designed or engineered? That is, can a complex system be driven towards an ideal future state? Right? In the words of Eliza Doolittle, not bloody likely. Well, why is this? Complex systems are fundamentally different. These systems do not lend themselves to a reductionist approach for reasons that I had just stated. Small changes in these systems may have massive impacts. You familiar with the butterfly effect from chaos theory? Right? That actually doesn't happen, but it's because it interacts with so many other things that a hurricane can't form, but the idea is important. Or, which is even more maddening for people that do project manager or are UX designers or whatever, changes may have no effect whatsoever. And you're left scratching your head, going, why is that? Because of the nature of the complex interactions, okay? These systems evolve. There actually is no ideal future state to be achieved. It doesn't exist, right? There is only fitness for purpose within what we call the situated present, right? And also, history has something to do with this as well, but I'm not going into that because the past informs the present. So. But an irony alert here, the present is generally more certain than the future, so we can be certain of that. You cannot know in advance which solution that you're advocating will work because of the dynamic nature of the network of interactions. There's too much going on. There's too many variables interacting with each other for you to be able to figure that out. Once you poke the system and it does that, it's already doing that. Okay? So working in complex systems is a little bit different. It seems like this would be very, very difficult. It seems like, oh, how would you operate in a complex system? In fact, it's very, very simple because we do it all the time. Unfortunately, we don't do it at work nearly enough. But in our home and our social systems, we're constantly acting as if it's a complex system. But at work, there's a tendency because of historical reasons for that always to be an ordered system. Okay? The only way to manage a complex adaptive system is by interacting with it. That's it. You can't sit off on the side and plan and do all your planning and then come back to the system and try to implement it. It doesn't work. by the time you get back to the system, it's already gone somewhere else. Okay? So in complex system, we can manage the constraints rather than managing a plan. So we can tighten and loosen constraints depending on what we want to do to the system, right? I was thinking about this the other day. It's like a meeting. If you're at this meeting and you're trying to brainstorm or something, but people are overly stuck on a particular idea, that's an over-constrained meeting. When on the other hand, they're just blathering about and nothing getting done, that's not constrained enough. And the way you can manage meetings is by either constraining them more to focus, or to loosen the constraints to loosen up the ideas, to allow more input, more ideas to come into the system. Okay? So we can apply what's called context-sensitive constraints, applying the constraints based on the context that you're operating in. And you can define the constraints by the Cynefin domains. Okay, we're about to get to Cynefin. So you can manage via constant small interactions within defined boundaries. So you can poke it and see where it goes, and then you can react to that and continually do that. You can monitor for emerging patterns, suppress that urge to categorize. Okay? So we're looking to identify patterns as they emerge in real time. And this is kind of carefully worded. We're seeking opportunities to allow the system to move in a desirable direction. And those attractors are those desirable directions. You're not pushing the system. You're setting or catalyzing attractors that the system is pulled towards. It's a fundamental difference. And once we're doing that, once we identify these patterns, we can either amplify or dampen them, rather than, again, trying to push the system towards an ideal future state. Okay? So we say the beneficial coherence, which is good things, right? They can be amplified via those attractors. Okay? Negative coherence, or bad things, you can dampen just by denying it energy or resources. Kill it. Kill it off. Don't feed it. I like this quote. How many know people like this? How many are people like this? It infuriates me to be wrong when I know I'm right. And this is my version of it. The right solution in the wrong context is the wrong solution. Okay?
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
I missed my cue for the intro on that, which is speaking of the right solution in the wrong context. Just take a look at Mr. Rumsfeld. How many remember that from 2002? How many did it make sense to at the time? Right? Well, I had some hands dropped. Well, now, being that I just kind of went into Cynefin a little bit, it should make perfect sense, but I thought that might be a good kicker into going back into Cynefin, okay? So let us make sense of Mr. Rumsfeld using the Cynefin framework. So there's our friendly, happy Cynefin framework, and again, the definitions are the same, they haven't changed. So thinking of what Mr. Rumsfeld said, there are no knowns. There are things we know we know. Well, that's pretty clearly known causality, so that's obvious. Obvious domain stuff, right? Now, when you have known knowns or a known causality, this is where we can apply best practice. Here and only here. I see this on Twitter and on blogs every day trying to apply best practices to these other domains. Right? The reason why is best practice is past practice. We know what it is. That's why it's best. Right? So you can't apply them in the other domains when you have more variability. If you have multiple best practices, right, that means that you're probably in the complicated domain, and those are known as good practice, where you can have multiple experts disagreeing with each other. They may all be right. You just got to figure out which way you want to proceed. Right? So it's a knowable causality. It's the known unknowns. Okay. Complex, it gets a little weirder because there is no causality in complex. It's retrospectively coherence. There is no causality. It's the unknown unknowns. We don't know what we don't know. We have to try to figure out a way to figure out what we don't know. I'm getting weirder than Rumsfeld. This is emergent practice. Okay, we're looking for patterns to see what emerges out of the system. It's exploratory. In the chaotic, it's pretty easy. It's incoherent, much like Rumsfeld. It's unknowable unknowns. It's novel practice. Now, you can go into chaos, but you have to be very, very careful about it. You have to have an escape mechanism, because if you don't want to fall into chaos, but if you find yourself in chaos, you need to act in order to get out of it, which leads me to the next slide. How do we respond in the different domains? Okay. The obvious domain, as we sort of talked about, we sense, categorize, respond. Oh, and by the way, I am going to be handing out sheets that have the Cynefin domain and all this information in it, so you don't have to scribble this all down. I have a little cheat sheet made up for you. So, and I've broke it out over several slides, so all be in one place for you. So we sense, categorize, respond in the obvious domain because that's where we can categorize. Makes sense for us. In the complicated domain, we sense, analyze, respond because there are multiple right answers to it. And in the complex domain, we probe the system, poke it with a stick. Then we sense and see what happens when we poke it, and then we respond off of that. And then in the chaotic, obviously, we would need to act. Right? We need to stabilize it. We need to put constraints on it. Now, one of the things you might notice here is sense and respond here are on the outsides, on the ordered side of things. On the unordered sides, they're next to each other, right? So we say here that they're loosely coupled, the sense and respond. In unordered systems, they are tightly coupled. And I'll leave that for you to ponder what that means. So this is me kind of going over the generalized way of looking at these different domains, and that is that in the obvious domain, you have standard operating procedures, right? Clearly, because you know the relationship between cause and effect. Things are self-evident. This is where you automate, right? Because you want to automate it because you don't want to be paying a lot of attention to it, because this is probably where things go here to die, is a good way to put it. You don't want to pay much attention to them anymore. Right? And also, information here can be codified. So you can put it in a manual. It's a good place for checklists that aren't going to change. Every time that I get into an airplane and I see the pilot going through his checklists, I feel very good about that flight. And here is my second bugaboo. My first one was best practices. You can focus on efficiency in the obvious domain. If you try to focus on efficiency in any of these other domains, you'll be over-constraining the system. The reason you can focus on efficiency here is because you have a history. You know what's going on, and you can squeeze it out and make it more and more efficient. You can't do that in the other domains because you will be removing variability, over-constraining. So in complicated, again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a systems thinking approach. Things are not self-evident. You have to figure out what they are. And we can test and refine hypotheses here. We can do kind of a similar thing in complex, but the nature of the hypothesis is different. This is an engineering approach, that building metaphor that I was talking about before. Here you trust the experts. Here you can focus on goals, because we know that relationship between cause and effect is knowable. Complex is a complexity-based approach where you can create multiple safe-to-fail interventions. Now, I could highlight any one of those words and go off for quite a long time as to why they're important or what's important about that particular word. But for now, I'm just going to use the example of multiple experiments. The reason you want to run them multiple at the same time, you don't want to run an experiment, then an experiment, then an experiment, because by the time you get to the third experiment, the system conditions have changed, which will invalidate your first run. So you want to run them all at the same time, and there are methods to help you figure out how to set these up, right? So you want variety in those tests. I'm not going to get into that. You're also, again, you're focusing on patterns, or like in the puzzle pieces I was talking about earlier, you're looking for clusters, patterns, Okay? You're looking to gain insights from those patterns so that you can act on them. And again, because the system is constantly changing, you manage in the present, or focus on the evolutionary potential, evolution because it's evolving and co-evolving, of the present moment. Chaos is pretty easy. It's crisis management. You have to act in chaos, right? The reason why is because there are no constraints in chaos. So if you don't, and nothing stays in chaos for very long. It's a high energy state. So things go into chaos and they resolve very quickly. What you want to do is be the one that imposes the constraint on that before somebody or something else does, so that you can at least get a handle on it or a claw hold on it, so you can hopefully move it into complex and get a little bit more sophisticated about it. Okay? So chaos is a transitionary domain. Nothing stays there for long. So if it's there, you want to be the one to control it. Okay? So urgent, rapid response, that makes sense. Define the constraint while you can. Okay? Then the last part here, just to go down the home stretch here, is I want to kind of show you something that is inspired by a cognitive edge method called four-corner or four-point contextualization. Now, for those of you that are familiar with this, this is just inspired by it, just so that I can show some of the earlier points. It's not actually quite how we would do a four-point contextualization, but it kind of uses some of the stuff from it. So what we have here is we've removed the borders, and we've taken the domains and we've pulled them into the corners. Okay? Disorder is still in the middle, so we still have our 5 domains. Now, I want you to think of these corners as being like either magnets, or these are supposed to be planets, by the way, that have gravitational pulls. So things that enter in here, which you'll see in a moment, have a certain gravitas, is that the right way? A gravity towards one of these corners. They're naturally attracted to it. Now, what you want to do when you're doing one of these exercises, you want to pull in multiple people with different perspectives so that you can haggle and argue over where you think they go. And when I'll show you, I'll drop the first one in there, and the reason it's bouncy is it kind of shows movement. So this submitting an invoice sort of gets pulled or is attracted towards the obvious. But what you're actually doing is you're triangulating, right? So if it's here, you're triangulating against the obvious, against the disordered, and against the complicated. And here's the other triangle, and there's one there. So anything that pops into that general area, you triangulate against those 3. So that's not categorization. So we're going to drop a couple of other ones in here, and I'm not saying these are where they go, but this is where you could have conversations about where they might go. Refactoring code, it's sort of more complicated. Troubleshooting an outage, it's hopefully kind of obvious, but maybe, who knows? Shooting rampage. This one's interesting. Who would say that the shooting rampage would go into the chaotic? Raise your hand. Really? Wow. Who thinks that a shooting ramp... What's that? I was hoping somebody would ask that because that's very important, and I'm about to get to that. I'm saying if you're a civilian. Is everybody who... Okay, as a civilian, do you think that it would be in chaos? Raise your hand. That's still a low number. Who thinks it would be in complex? I'm not saying there's no right answer, so don't worry about it. How about there are wrong answers, however. How about complicated? Okay, how about obvious? Okay. So the reason the shooting rampage is interesting is that, remember I was talking about identities earlier? Now it depends on your identity. If I'm a civilian on the street, I think it's clearly chaotic. That wouldn't get a whole lot of argument there. I'd be interested in hearing why. Huh? I'm assuming that you're there, otherwise you wouldn't be dealing with it. Oh, okay. Was anybody confused about where the shooting rampage was occurring? Well, I don't mean confused in a bad way. I just mean I didn't know. Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so it's happening at Spotify. Okay. So what I was getting at is a shooting rampage could be different depending on the identity. So what would the shooting rampage be if you were a first responder, say the sheriff department on the scene? I'm not going into the timeline here, I'm just saying at the moment that the responder gets there. Well, they're trained in these things, so you can imagine that it might be more complex. I'm not saying it is. There is no right answer. I'm just saying that you could imagine that it could be that way, because I'm going to make a point in that if there's a SWAT team who's very, very, very highly trained on this, they may be approaching it more complicated. So the identity or the context that you're approaching this from, based on your history of who you are or what your role is could be different. Okay? So I was just pointing out that a shooting rampage is kind of a good example. You can do that with all of these. In fact, you should be doing that. Different roles in the organization is going to have different ideas of where these land. That's why you want to have what's called requisite variety of the people that are there. You don't want uniformity of thought because it's a sense-making framework. So I'll throw a few more in there. Creating product buzz is pretty fuzzy, so I threw it over in complex side or unordered. It's up to you to decide whether it stays there. Operating a startup, that one's a little closer to disordered, but again, that's up to you to decide. And building a house. Now the magic happens. We lay the framework over it. Data preceded the framework. Now we can say, oh, I'm going to treat these as if they're obvious. I'm going to treat this as if it's complicated. I can act because now I know what the context is in terms of how we've defined out the domains. Finding new markets, product buzz, oh, I think I'll treat them as complex. Shooting rampage, chaotic. Now what do you do about these ones that are straddlers? Remember I said earlier that unordered systems can have pockets of order, and ordered systems can have pockets of unordered. If we don't know where this goes, that's probably what's happening. That's why it's straddling the line. So what we can do is remove the boundaries once again, break it out into its component pieces, or what we, the best component pieces that we can come up with at the time. We can run the exercise again. We're having conversations, talking about it. Talking. Then boom, you lay the framework over it again. Doomp, 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 doomp. That's how I can deal with it. And you can repeat if you find these things on borders again. Now, this is not a true four-point contextualization, how you would do it. So again, this is inspired by four-point contextualization. It's actually a little more complicated than that. But this gives you a general idea. However, I'll change context on you again. I didn't say where we were building the house. What if we were building a house on Mars? Right? All of these things are probably going to be different because it probably is in complex. Hopefully it's not in chaos or we're in trouble. Right? Or what if you're building a birdhouse in your garage? Right? That's probably rather obvious. However, what if we are in a storm and our car breaks down, right, and we need to build a shelter? This actually happened to me when I was a kid. I fell through some ice up to here. I was about 5 miles from any road, and I had to, and this is in the middle of the winter, and I had to decide instantaneously whether I could make it to the road before my feet froze. Right? I had to act. It's chaotic, act. Luckily, I had a lighter on me because I always carried a lighter, so I had to build a fire. So it's my little Jack London story, build a fire. I survived. I didn't lose any toes. In conclusion, a complexity-based approach asks the following questions. What is going on at the moment, now? It's not an idealized future state. What's going on now in the system? In the context of what's going on at the moment, what can we change? Out of the things that we can change, what and how can we monitor for the impact of the change that we're going to place on the system? And out of the things that we can monitor for impact, how can we amplify good things, and how can we dampen bad things? Okay? In other words, we want to evolve the system forward to a future state which is more resilient and sustainable, but which we could not have anticipated. That's the key part of that line, which we could not have anticipated. Because complex systems operate a little bit differently. All right? Now, Cynefin can help us to understand whether we want to take a complexity-based approach or a more traditional ordered approach, right? And each has validity. Certain things you do want to use an ordered approach for. That's perfectly fine if you know that causality. But you only want to apply them in the proper context. So that's the end of story time for today. I bet you forgot we were in story time, didn't you? Thank you. There's some other sources for you. Thank you very much.